Hi everyone, and welcome to this new video in which we continue our close reading of Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodor, Adorno and Horkheimer. Today we're going to read the fifth thesis of Elements of Antisemitism. Last week we've talked about the fourth thesis, and we explained how the Jews basically became the perfect scapegoats for everything bad in the world. And we also looked at the religious roots of antisemitism. And in this fifth thesis, Adorno and Horkheimer look at the notion of idiosyncrasy and how it relates to anti-Semitism. Now, idiosyncrasy means the particular behavior or way of speaking or thinking of a certain individual. It's like the things that makes you unique. Maybe it's an accent, or you have a word that you use a lot, almost instinctively. Like, for example, the word like. Many people would put the word like in all of their sentences. Yeah, like I don't know. Yeah, like that doesn't make any sense. Or when someone always wants to ride the front seat of the car, for example, like the peculiar things that make you you. The word literally means someone's own private constitution. Like idios in Greek means private or own. Son means with, and crassus means mixture or constitution. So idiosyncrasy means to be with one's own constitution or mixture. Everything that makes you, well, you. So what do idiosyncrasies have to do with anti-Semitism? Well, Adorno and Horkheimer start the thesis with a reference to Wagner's opera Siegfried, which is the third installment in his Der Ring des Nibelungen, and it's about Siegfried, who is a German folk hero who, in the legend, he was raised by a dwarf named Mime, and Mime wants Siegfried to become a warrior and kill Fafnir, and Fafnir is a dragon who took a magical ring, and Mime wants that ring. So he hopes that Siegfried will get it back for him. The problem is that Siegfried hates Mime, and he has been trying to escape from him ever since he was a boy, but Mime is always trying to make Siegfried love him, telling him that he has no one but him as a father and even as a mother. But Siegfried is always rejecting his love. I cannot simply abide you, so do not forget it, says Siegfried to Mime, who is trying to win his love. So I cannot simply abide you means that I can never love you because, well, you are repulsive. Like Siegfried says that to Mime, that you are horrible and repulsive, and he must never forget that Siegfried can never love him because that's the way he is. You know, Siegfried is simply incapable of loving Mime. And so what does this mean? What does this have to do with anti-Semitism and idiosyncrasy? Well, in this context, Siegfried is the anti-Semite and Mime is the figure of the Jew. And the anti-Semite finds the Jew repulsive because that's how the anti-Semite is. It's his own idiosyncrasy that makes him see the Jew as Mime. They argue that the stock reply of all anti-Semites is the appeal to idiosyncrasy. Society's emancipation from anti-Semitism depends on whether the content of that idiosyncrasy is raised to the level of a concept and becomes aware of its own senselessness. So, already they say that all anti-Semites justify their anti-Semitism on the basis of their idiosyncrasy. And to be free from anti-Semitism, we must raise the content of the anti-Semite's idiosyncrasy to the level of a concept. Now, in other words, the authors want us to examine the behavior and thoughts of the anti-Semite, and that the anti-Semite examines his own idiosyncrasy, to think about it critically. In philosophy, when we talk about concepts, we are talking about grasping the content of that concept. As in, I understand what mechanisms are behind that content. Just like when you take a racist or a sexist and they have their own idiosyncrasy, they have their behavior, thoughts and opinions, and they want to hold on to them no matter what. It's like people saying it's just my opinion when they say something racist. Like they have the right to be who they are, to have the opinions and behaviors that they want. That's just the way I am, and just deal with it. But that's a problem because these people don't want to think about their biases or opinions, and if they do, if they try to think about them in a conceptual way, they will automatically see the inherent contradictions in their opinions, and they become aware of how nonsensical their opinion is. So how does that work? How does a conceptual analysis of anti-Semitism work in this context? Well, they argue that there is a dichotomy between the particular and the universal, which conceptually must be in a dialectical process, right? Like one is the antithesis of the other. Now, idiosyncrasy is attached to the particular. And the problem is that when something is raised to the level of a concept, it can become universal. So the particular cannot attach itself to the universal conceptually speaking, But the anti-Semite, well, he does that. They do so by arguing or believing that their particular way of being is natural, and the proof of it, they would argue, is its social utility. Like for the anti-Semite, the Jew is a threat to the social order, and therefore their anti-Semitism is more useful to society than being tolerant, for example. But idiosyncrasy attaches itself to the peculiar, the universal, that which fits into the context of social utility is regarded as natural. And what this means is that whatever works for society must be natural and therefore universal. So for the anti-Semite, it is only natural to be an anti-Semite because there cannot be a society that functions with Jews. But of course, this is a social belief. It is a peculiar belief. The anti-Semite just feels an aversion towards the Jews and takes his particular feeling to mean a general truth. If I feel some aversion towards X, it's not because my society has conditioned me or because of a bias or anything like that. No, it's because X is objectively repulsive. So the only logical thing to do from there is to stay away from X. And so mime is by nature repulsive. So Siegfried is simply following nature. We only survive by avoiding the things that disgust us. The idea of progress is embedded in this mentality. What arouses aversion or disgust, since it is against self-preservation, well, it must be against progress. And therefore, the authors say, anything natural which has not been absorbed into utility by passing through the cleansing channels of conceptual order, whatever is not quite assimilated or infringes the commands in which the progress of centuries has been sedimented, is felt as intrusive and arouses a compulsive aversion. So this is a fancy way of saying that the collective shapes how we see each other. Whatever the collective decides upon must be true, because if the collective agrees on something, then that something must be natural, it must be universal. And so the concept therefore becomes a tool to express domination and conformity. The concept, as we said, is what grasps reality, what allows us to understand it, what captures the patterns of the natural world. But the concept, like we said about rules in the thesis about religion, is something that arises from emotional and irrational practices that it tries to rationalize. But the concept pretends that it is not rationalizing something irrational, but that the thing it grasps is already rational. Like if it tries to rationalize the irrational, then it's game over for it. It becomes automatically irrational. And so therefore everything that doesn't seem appealing to the rationalization process, anything that cannot be attached to a concept, everything that, like we said last time, resists rationalization, is seen with fear and suspicion, and with disgust and aversion. Things like, for example, the screech of stylus on slate, which sets the teeth on edge, the loooooong, which brings to mind filth and corruption, the sweat which appears on the brow of the diligent. Now all of these are things that arouse aversion and therefore must be avoided. So the screech on slate is like that very annoying sound that you can do with your nails on a plate. Loooooong is about cuisine, when there is a dish that was desirable in the past but people don't eat it anymore today and found it disgusting. Like when sometimes we ask, how could people eat that? And well, the sweat of the diligent means the sweat that we see on people when they make efforts. So all of these things are related to bodily fluids, screechy sounds, and outdated fashion. All of these cannot be grasped by the concept, like when we said in the conclusion of last video that the anti-Semite cannot stand a truth that doesn't rationalize evil. And here it's the same thing. What cannot be comprehended by reason must be put down. But here the dialectical process of anti-Semitism appears. For a reminder, the dialectic here means that as you try to become something by running away from something else, you become the thing that you are running away from. Reason runs away from barbary to become more reason, but it turns into barbary. So here the running away from the things that arouse aversion is, for the fascist, what guarantees his survival. Like the Nazi fascist wants to remain alive because they claim to love vitality, whereas whatever is Jewish is a denial of life. So by running away from the Jews, they expect to gain more vitality, to be more alive. So for them, life is best represented by nature, hence their love for nature. So their claim of superiority is also in relationship with their belief that they are the closest beings to nature, that they gain their strength directly from nature itself, and hence their prejudices towards the Jews. Their prejudice towards Jews are only natural, since it preserves their life, their energy, their mobility. So the point of staying alive is to be able to move, right? To experience things, to conquer, etc. So what they value, what the Nazis value, is mobility. But as we've already established, the Jew is precisely that same nature that they are worshipping. It is the reminder of mana. But they don't want nature. They want the inoffensive version of nature, the one in which mana doesn't exist. And because they claim to the opposite of nature, a manaless nature, let's say, that is not nature. A nature without mana is not nature. Then their own, and if that's what they that's what they want, well, their own quest towards nature reverts to its opposite. They become the ones who are immobile. The more agitated they are, the more immobile they become. For a few moments, they mimic the motionlessness of surrounding nature. But as what is mobile draws closer to the immobile, more highly developed life to mere nature, it also estranged from it, since immobile nature, which living creatures like Daphne seek with utmost agitation to become, is capable only of the most external spatial relationships. So there are many things to unpack in this passage. First, Daphne, in Greek mythology, Daphne is a nymph, a naiad, to be more precise. It's a type of nymph who lives in the mountains. And so nymphs are minor female deities associated with nature, and they are often the object of forceful advances from gods and satyrs. Like Daphne was loved by the god Apollo, who constantly chased after her when she just wanted to be left alone. And the only way for Apollo to leave her alone was for her to get transformed into a laurel tree, precisely to become immobile. And so Adorno and Horkheimer use this metaphor to talk about anti-Semitisms. Anti-Semites, sorry. Like Daphne, they are agitated, they are constantly running away from a danger that they are running away from a danger, and the more they run away from it, the more immobile they become. The more they run, the more they limit their own movements. Now, in the myth, it's about a powerful god trying to rape a defenseless nymph. So, not the best analogy to talk about the relationship between Jews and Nazis here. Like, the Nazis would be closer to Apollo here than Daphne, but that's beside the point. The point is, the point that the authors are trying to make is how the agitation that the anti-Semite expresses in their hatred towards Jews leads them to be very limited and to resemble the existence that they claim to actively trying to avoid, which is an existence of passivity. So how does that happen? Well, remember the quote. It says that there are moments in which the anti-Semite mimics the motionlessness of surrounding nature, right? So what are those moments? Well, they're the moments in which aversion is experienced. It's when we grind our teeth because we hear a screechy sound, or when we see, the loooooong. Those are the moments that the authors talk about. And the reason why they are called motionless is because they are completely passive, autonomous. They are a spontaneous bodily reaction. Like when you see someone yawn, you yawn too. It's completely, unreflective behavior. And so these are moments that are not controlled by the subject or by the self which experiences itself in such reactions, rigidity of the skin, muscles, and limbs, is not quite master of them. But this is the thing from which the anti-Semitic idiosyncrasy emerges. In other words, the uniqueness of the anti-Semite, his way of being, which is unique to him, is the result of natural bodily reactions. There is no thought that comes with it, no self-reflecting capacities. It's just, fear, like any animal experiences fear in the face of a predator or when it sees a danger. As they write, the motives which trigger such idiosyncrasy are those which allude to origin. They recreate moments of biological prehistory, danger signs which made the hair stand on the end and the heart stop. In the idiosyncratic version, individual organs escape the subject's control, autonomously obeying fundamental biological stimuli. So in other words, the anti-Semite is not building a relationship with nature like he thinks he is. He thinks that he's dominating nature. He thinks that he is the predator, while in reality he's acting like the prey in the state of nature, or the predator who is not hunting a prey but senses a danger approaches. Like a wild bobcat, for example, who makes the hair on his back stand up. So the mentality in which the anti-Semite is always, a fight or flight situation, which overwhelms him in both cases. And so he chooses the third option, which is petrification in the face of danger. So they are just mimicking the prehistorical behavior that they blame the Jews for exhibiting. Like the proponents of progress are the ones living in prehistory. They are the ones who are simply mimicking biological reactions in their surroundings. When the anti-Semite is created, it is always through imitation of the collective. Racists are racist because the collective forces them to adopt their behavior without even questioning them. And so the proponents of progress hated when they see this behavior in animals, when animals simply repeat sounds or behaviors without forming their own opinions and understanding about it. They see the animal as always stuck in their space without many options because they are unreflective creatures. But then how is the anti-Semite any different, right? Like he too doesn't get the chance to develop his capacities. He doesn't get the chance to progress. Progress has actually become just a pretext for him to remain in the same place while keeping everything else at a distance. When Daphne turns into a tree, she's seeking to establish the most extreme distance between her and Apollo. But in the end, she created an extreme distance between her and everything else in the world. Like she's the one who gets stuck, while those who don't embrace progress keep moving. And so hence the phrase the space is here to mean absolute alienation. The anti-Semite ends up building thicker and thicker walls that alienate him from all surroundings. Space is absolute alienation, where the human seeks to resemble nature, at the same time it hardens itself against it. Protection as petrified terror is a form of camouflage. So that's what the anti-Semite is resigned to. He lives his life in a form of camouflage, petrified in terror by the Jew. He claims to want to resemble nature, but at the same time alienates himself from it. He builds up walls and lengthens the distance between himself and nature, which causes him to regress back into nature. So the more he tries to run away from mana, the more violently he experiences it. So progress only unleashes mana on him to a crippling level, while those who learn to live with mana and alongside it, the superstitious, they manage to cope with mana. And as such, the old and the obsolete get to enjoy life, while the progressive lives a life that is not so different from death. Like they are corpses that are moving by someone else's will, like empty shells. They have no individuality. Let's just say it like that. As they write, the non-human reactions are archaic patterns of self-preservation. The tribute life pays for its continued existence is adaptation to death. And so we see the paradox of how these people, the anti-Semites who value their identity, their idiosyncrasy, end up losing it. What is scary about mana is the mimesis that nature performs. The mimicking, as we said, of the surrounding nature is undesirable because it implies that they are not individuals, that their idiosyncrasy is an empty shell. So the anti-Semite is afraid of an organic reaction, whether it is in nature or in society. In society, the anti-Semite wants to be the individual free from the pressures of the collective. He doesn't want to imitate other people. He wants to have his own opinion, his own individuality, etc. But in the end, he ends up reproducing what everyone thinks, what everyone does, and what everyone says. So running away from mimesis only strengthens the mimesis. And so it's only in the illusion sustained by the culture industry that anti-Semites have their individuality. So however, the relationship towards mimesis is not a dilemma of either we just accept it as it is or we just run away from it. There's no just accepting it. If we simply accept mimesis, we won't be able to produce civilization. So the other option is the control of mimesis. And as Adorno and Horkheimer say, civilization replaced the organic adaptation to otherness, mimetic behavior proper, firstly in the magical phase, with the organized manipulation of mimesis, and finally in the historical phase with rational praxis, which is work. Uncontrolled mimesis is proscribed. So even in the magical phase, we have a control of mimesis. And once we got in the historical phase, when we left prehistory, magic was replaced with work by the rational organization of space and matter. In all cases, we cannot have uncontrolled mimesis. Proscribed means prohibited, right? So hence that's what we call progress. It's the attempt to control mimesis. All civilization is built up on that premise. We have to control mimesis. Even the myth of Adam and Eve in Genesis is about that. According to the authors, the angel which with fiery sword drove humans out of paradise and on the path of technical progress is itself the symbol of that progress. So in other words, we are forced out of nature, out of paradise, and now must find ways of controlling mimesis so that we don't fall back into it. Magic was a way of doing that, and work is another way of doing that. But there are fundamental differences between work and magic. In work, mimesis is severely repressed. Like God throwing out Adam and Eve from the garden was done with extreme violence. Man is now forced to work. Like work differs from magic since it actually desires the suppression of mimesis and has been a tool for rulers to control and suppress both their successors and the masses in ways never reached by magic. In magic, you can, for example, make pictures and graven images, since representation was thought to be linked like names, for example, to the things that they represent. They are actual imitation and reproduction of their subjects. But with the advent of work, we see the rise of iconoclasm. Now, an iconoclast is someone who destroys images. In monotheistic religions, for example, representation is mostly regarded with distrust, and it is common to have statues or images destroyed, poets, actors, and gypsies ostracized. The authors talk about this as the continuation of civilization, that you have to destroy everything related to mimesis if you want to have progress. So no images. I mean, even when it is tolerated, like in Christianity, it wasn't without its limitations and without its debates. And even more so, the tolerance for paintings and frescoes in Christianity is done in a way that mimesis becomes the mimesis of Christ and of the religion that prescribes mimesis. Like nothing must distract you from work, from full-on progress, and magic, mimesis, art, etc. are all distractions that pull us back into nature. All forms of education must lead to that end. Social and individual education reinforces the objectifying behavior required by work and prevents people from submerging themselves once more in the ebb and flow of surrounding nature. All distraction, indeed all devotion, has an element of mimicry. So this, the author's claim, is what creates and forges the ego. The ego is what stands against mimicry, and we even hear this often today when we encourage people, for example, to be authentic, as to stand against mimesis and to avoid mimicking other people. In Tunisia, we say "amal shakhsiya," which literally means have a personality, as in, don't mimic the personality of others and affirm yourself against collective pressure. And that's why we need an ego. To stand against mimetic behavior. The transition from reflecting mimesis to controlled reflection completes its formation. Bodily adaptation to nature is replaced by recognition in a concept, the subsuming of difference under sameness. So they talk about the formation of the ego. It is, controlled reflection when you decide what you want to reflect. Reflecting mimesis means that you just reflect what the surrounding environment wants you to reflect, while controlling reflection, that's the ego that decides what to reflect. And what the ego wants to reflect is, well, the ego. Like, in other words, we don't want our bodies to adapt to nature. When the body adapts, it means that it has given up, that it has surrounded to nature and is now reflecting that nature. Instead, we want to be in charge of what we reflect, and that is recognition in a concept. As you see, there is an asterisk there, and it's not without its significance. It's a reference to Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. It's the same edition that we mentioned in the excursus, the one translated by Smith, but it's in section B 103, in case you don't have the edition. So you have this notion of recognition in a concept, and in that section of Critique of Pure Reason, Kant talks about synthesis. Now, what's synthesis for Kant? Well, it's the way we organize information to make them make sense with one another. You can do this in three ways. You can organize information either by apprehending it in intuition, reproducing it in imagination, or by recognizing it in concepts. So here we are interested in the third type, and for Kant, recognizing something requires a concept because it is through memory that I can recognize something. Memory isn't reproducing something that I saw, but recognizing what I saw. Let's say I come across a thing made of wood and has 4 legs, for example, with a surface on top. That's a table or a chair or a stool. When I see it again, I can reproduce the same representation that I had the last time, but that doesn't mean that I am recognizing that this is a stool. To be able to do that, I need a concept that makes me able to recognize other things that are also made of wood and have 4 legs and a surface as a stool. So not all stools or not all chairs or tables have the same form or colors, so I may not recognize other chairs or tables or stools if they are different from the first one that I saw. But I do remember that chair when I see others through the concept of the chair, for example. So when I recognize something, I am seeing something that reminds me of the concept that I have in mind. I see all kinds of chairs and I'm like, okay, that fits into the concept of a chair, just like all those other objects that look like it and that I saw already. So that is a chair. And hence there is a unity between the sequence of perception of chairs. Like I can keep track of all the times I saw a chair, all the images I come across of chairs have this sense of unity within the concept of a chair. So in order for me to recognize something, I need to synthesize my perception of the thing and the concept that I have in mind. So now for Kant, being a rationalist, he believes that we are born with concepts. Not concepts like chairs and table, but concepts like categories, numbers, quality, quantity, and relational concepts. Like they are innate, and from them we form the rest. So in this sense, with the arrival of enlightenment, it is literally the mind, your ego, that you try to reproduce, to mimic over and over again onto the world. And more importantly, everything in the world, all the differences in things lose their particularities under the synthesis with the concept. All wooden pieces with 4 legs and a surface are tables, for example, and all are interchangeable with one another. There are no tables that are special or irreplaceable. And so this leads the authors to claim that the move from bodily adaptation to recognition in a concept is synonymous with subsuming difference under sameness. And this is where the paradox hits. If difference is subsumed under sameness, then you are mimicking. You are just creating differences, but through the same process or principle. It's what we've seen with the culture industry. You only get difference on a superficial level. You get different flavors, but it's the same ice cream. And if that's the case, then it means that you are not out of nature. The terror that we are trying to escape by limiting mimesis is actually here with us. Quote, the constellation under which sameness is established, both the direct sameness of mimesis and the indirect sameness of synthesis, the adaptation of the self to the thing in the blind act of living, no less than the comparison of reified elements in scientific conceptualization, that constellation remains terror. So whenever whether we are following the mimesis of nature, that's the direct sameness of mimesis, whether we are following the sameness of nature, that everything lives only to survive, our existence is nothing more but, sustaining the bodily functions, or we are following the mimesis of science, that is the indirect sameness of the synthesis, in the end we are living under the same terror. The animal that responds to simple stimuli in its body to react to its environment is no different from the scientists with his equations and test tubes. Both live under the same terror. So society, science, etc., all of them are just perpetuating nature. They are not standing against it. They perpetuate it in the individual, they perpetuate the same patterns, the same behaviors, the same thoughts as everything around him, while claiming to have given the individual agency. And so the cult of reason is the fanatic belief that with reason we are finally out of the irrationality of nature, which hinders our fulfillment and our happiness. But in the end, the scientist is as irrational as the magician, and perhaps even more, since he is just making nature's terror more inescapable. Quote, the mathematical formula is consciously manipulated regression, just as the magic ritual was. It is the most sublimated form of mimicry. So the advent of science only brought an order more repressive than nature. That's the social order, and even more repressive compulsion to maintain it at all costs. It's about, systemic self-preservation, and that principle is repeated and recreated in the individual to such extent that it just crushes the individual. Like, in order for the social order to maintain itself, the individuals must disappear while believing that reason, the same reason that brought the social order in question, is what guarantees their individuality. And hence it is a regression in two senses. It is a regression as in we are regressing to a state of nature in which mimicry is absolute, but it's also a regression in the sense of we are making ourselves worse in terms of freedom. Like those superstitious people who believed in magic had more freedom than us. And so this is because, at least in the magical stage, mimesis left thought free. It only limited itself to bodily mimicry, whereas technology and science apply mimesis to both bodies and thought. In technology, the adaptation of lifelessness in the service of self-preservation is no longer accomplished, as in magic, by bodily imitation of extreme nature, but by automating mental processes, turning them into blind sequences. So it is in this sense that thought is inhibited. It only cares about its own self-preservation by simply repeating the dominant thought. If I want to survive, then I have to think like everybody else. I have to reproduce the thoughts of others, the thoughts of the collective, of fashion, of advertisement, etc. Hence, thinking becomes a process like a calculator does additions and multiplications. It is completely unreflective and simply becomes a succession of blind sequences. And so the irony is that technology does this, hoping to protect thinking from mimesis, from manipulation and domination, from both ideology and nature. But in reality, human beings have never been more vulnerable to domination, manipulation, and mimicry than in the age of reason. Quote, with its triumph, human expressions become both controllable and compulsive. All that remains of the adaptation to nature is the hardening against it. So that's like Daphne, who as she tries to adapt to nature that chases her, finds no way to survive but to harden herself against that same nature. She turns herself into a tree, into a camouflage, so that she gets to be left alone. But then she is no longer distinguishable from any other tree, and therefore she has made herself more vulnerable to the lumberjack. The lumberjack is someone who cuts down trees, but the lumberjack is also a Daphne on the run. In the end, the camouflage of Daphne is instrumental reason. She uses it to hide herself from nature by dominating nature, but in the process it is actually nature that dominates her even more violently. The camouflage, quote, used to protect and strike terror. Terror today is the blind mastery of nature, which is identical to farsighted instrumentality. So, long story short, mimesis must be forgotten. The bourgeois apparatus is all founded on this premise: forget mimesis. But as Adorno and Horkheimer write, in the bourgeois mode of production, the ineradicable mimetic heritage present in all praxis is consigned to oblivion. The pitiless ban on regression appears like an edict of fate. The denial is so total that it is no longer registered consciously. So what's very interesting about this quote is the word ineradicable. Mimesis cannot be eradicated. So what happens when you try to forget something that you cannot eradicate, when you experience trauma, for example, and you try to eradicate it by forgetting about it, what happens next? Well, the trauma remains there. It goes to your unconscious, and from there it will manifest itself without you knowing. Like the trauma, the more you try to suppress it, the stronger it gets. And so the pitiless ban on regression is an edict of fate, because like with faith, people try to suppress their own desires, their own thoughts and drives. So we try to do the same with mimesis. The fear of progress is the ban we put on mimesis, but we are not aware that mimesis continues to be there, to be active. We are just not aware of it, but we see its manifestations. Those blinded by civilization have contact with their own tabooed mimetic traits only through certain gestures and forms of behavior that they encounter in others as isolated, shameful residues in their rationalized environment. What repels them as alien is all too familiar. So, mimesis manifests itself in everyday encounters. We see it in others, in their gestures, for example, but also in our own gestures. The gestures that show mimesis are precisely the kind of gestures that civilization prohibits or allows with strict regulations. Those are called gestures of immediacy. Quote, it lurks in the contagious gestures of an immediacy suppressed by civilization. Gestures of touching, nestling, soothing, coaxing. So all the gestures that privilege closeness or favor connection with others are devalued. So the anti-Semite denies himself those gestures because they are seen as contagious and will infect him like a disease that will bring him back to the state of nature. So nurturing, loving, bonding, soothing, etc. are dangerous because they remind us of nature and of mimesis. They're all about feelings and emotions which can lead the ego to its own annihilation. And so hence those gestures, when they emanate from others, they must be from those who must be isolated into ghettos, as in trying to contain an epidemic. Like emotions and gestures of mimesis are attributed to those considered a residue in rationalized environment. For the anti-Semite, those are the Jews. But it also affects them in their closest relationships with their parents, children, spouses, friends, etc. All types of relationships must be modeled on the repression of mimetic traits. And we talked about this in the second excursus when we talked about morality and how morality became to be seen as a superstition. If a man shows emotions, then there is something wrong with him. And women being by nature too emotional, they must be contained by the patriarchy. And so the same principle applies to racial and sexual minorities. But then individuals must be repelled by what is the most familiar to them. Familiar in the sense of, well, we are mimetic creatures, like mimesis is the thing that we are the most familiar with, but also as in our closest relationships. The more we familiarize ourselves with others or even with things, the more repulsive they must be. So if I make an emotional connection with, for example, the watch that my grandfather left me, for example, I'll be committing a superstition and therefore mimesis. A watch must be seen as nothing more than just a watch. Anything else implies that I'm projecting my subjectivity on the natural world, and that's animism. So we are just prohibited to form proximity with both objects and people. Whenever I become familiar with something, I must look at it as something strange, weird, alienated from me, kind of like a trauma. the trauma acts like a distortion of all kinds of relationships. Whenever I come close to someone, the trauma disfigures that relationship. And so the familiar, through trauma, the familiar feels wrong. And so the authors draw on Freud's notion of the uncanny. Like the alien is all too familiar is a reference to Freud's essay, The Uncanny. The uncanny for Freud, in German, unheimlich, isn't just the unfamiliar, as in what is unpleasant, for example. Rather, the unfamiliar is the familiar. Like, without entering into details, because for Freud this has to do with the Oedipus complex. We don't really need that here. We can just stick to the simplest example from which Freud starts his analysis of the uncanny, and that is the wax figure. Like, he takes this from another writer, Jensch, I think that's how it is pronounced, and he says that what is uncanny is, for example, when you don't know if something that looks like that looks animate is really alive, or if something that looks like an animate thing isn't really alive. Like a wax figure, because it has the traits of a human being, it looks so familiar, but there is something weird about it, like it's not alive. But knowing that it is not alive but looks so familiar, almost feels like the figure can suddenly start moving. So you don't really know if it's alive or not, and this freaks you out. You see that there are boundaries that are pretty blurred, and this indeterminacy is what repulses you. You kind of feel threatened by the fact that that something that is so close to you is also so alien to you. And so this mimesis in nature works like that. It blurs the lines between the known and the unknown, the familiar and the unfamiliar. And because of that, it lacks structure, and it feels hard to make it make sense, kind of like, superstition. Superstitions are precisely the best thing to describe the uncanny. The belief in magic, for example, or enchanted objects is unsettling because an enchanted object makes us unsure if it's alive or dead. So the uncanny is equated with a regress. We are supposed to forget about these far-fetched ideas, and that is progress. Hence they say what makes such impulses repellent today is their outmodedness. So everything that has a sense of uncanniness is outmoded. It's not what modern enlightened people believe in. Instead, gestures and expressions must be purged from their outmoded beliefs. Gestures are denied, their emotional content, or their potential for creating emotional connections. Emotions are seen as a distortion of what is real and must be abandoned for something else, more aligned with the ideology of instrumental reason and progress. They are replaced by mere excitements, for example. When I feel something, I cannot take that feeling to be about something real, but a simple stimuli, a simple excitement without meaning, like an animal that reacts to either pleasure or pain. But then, without its meaning, what am I supposed to do with the emotion? Since emotions, if taken seriously, led me to illusion and error, what should I do with them? Well, the answer is do what we do with anything else in enlightenment. As we said, when everything is an illusion, the only criterion of truth is how to use that illusion to survive, to have more personal power. Hence, whenever I feel an emotion or provoke an emotion in others, it's only to manipulate. Either to manipulate others or to manipulate myself in a way to ensure my survival. So the role of emotions is only to win over people, to establish dominance over them. It's the whole point of politics and advertisement. As they write, in seeking to win over the buyer with flattery, the debtor with threats, the creditor with supplication, they appear to translate long-reified human relationships back into those of personal power. Any emotion is finally embracing, mere excitement is preferable. All unmanipulated expression appears like the grimace which the manipulated expression of the film actor, the lynch mob, the Führer's speech always was. So in other words, only manipulated expressions appear like unmanipulated. Expressions that are not subject to emotion, but simple excitement are what is real. Like lies are therefore trusted while truth is regarded with distrust. We end up believing the staged expression on the billboard or in the commercial or in the movie or in the political speech, but not the expression of our friends, partners, or the hungry beggars on the streets. So the former can be trusted because they have control over mimicry. They decide what must be shown to the public, while the latter have undisciplined mimicry. And this undisciplined mimicry becomes the trademark of the victims of power. Since mimicry manifests itself whenever we like it or not, the victims of power don't really have a fair game. It's like we say, breathing is the sign that you are a bad person. Well, since you cannot stop breathing, you will be persecuted, especially when you don't have, like those in power, the tools to mask your breathing. So people are still going to show emotions. They are going to show the traits associated with undisciplined mimesis, and therefore these people will always be persecuted just for existing. Their persecution will even become their essence, since mimesis also brands its own persecution within itself. It's like each generation that comes from those who couldn't discipline mimesis is born with the mark of their own persecution. Undisciplined mimicry is the brand burned by the old domination into the living substance of the dominated, and is inherited through an unconscious process of imitation in early childhood, from generation to generation, from the Jewish rags and bonesman to the banker. So, in the case of anti-Semitism, the Jew is born with a sign to be persecuted. It's like he has a sign branded on his back that reads, "Kick me," with all the boot traces of everyone who kicked his ancestors. So those accused of undisciplined mimicry are born with scars, and of course their scars must never be shown either. If the Jew expresses his pain, then he is showing an emotion, which leads to further persecution. And so with each generation, the violence increases, but each time the Jew cannot complain unless they are willing to make it worse. And so rage is ultimately denied. Neither the tormented nor the tormentor must show their rage as they respectively receive and inflict pain. Because yes, the rage of the tormentor is prohibited too, which means that even when the tormentor experiences rage, he cannot let it show on his face. Like at least the rage will still indicate that there is some humanity left in them. But no, the anti-Semite guards and the SS, they must remain stoic, devoid of all emotions and agency as much as their victims. So the rage of civilized people is triggered when genuine rage makes its appearance. It is the compulsive moment in behavior, the rage of the tormentor and of the tormented, reappearing instinctively in the grimace that triggers the specific rage of civilized people. Impotent appearance is answered by deadly reality, play by seriousness. So to show a grimace that is, unplanned, unmarketable, means that there is something wrong, which in fascism you are never allowed to show. Things can never be wrong when the Führer is with us, when reason is with us. So things go wrong when we become human beings of flesh and blood. They go wrong because our survival depends on repressing what makes us human beings. Such mimicry provokes anger because it puts on show, in face of the new relationship of production, the old fear which one has had to forget in order to survive them. So Enlightenment argues that the only way for us to survive is through deadly reality and seriousness. Impotent appearance is like showing sadness, for example, or when people are just expressing how they feel, and you are trying to find solutions to their problems, and often when you think of a solution, the other person appears and feels literally impotent or dumb for not thinking about it before, right? Like showing emotions is weakness, whatever the emotion is. You appear impotent because you appear as incapable of mastering or disciplining mimicry. So you need to be hit with deadly reality, like stop whining and get your shit together. And so likewise, play is also undisciplined mimicry because it is a trait of children. And kids must be disciplined. We have to cure the childlessness of children. So seriousness is therefore disciplined mimicry, and when someone is being playful, we like to point to his naivety, like he is just dumb and naive like a child. Whereas, you know, here we need a real serious man, right? So it is only through seriousness that survival is guaranteed, and the activity that portrays seriousness the most is work, not play, but work. This is again explicitly expressed in the next paragraph about the grimace. They say, the grimace seems like play acting because instead of performing serious work, it prefers to portray displeasure. It appears to evade the seriousness of life by admitting it without restraint, therefore it is false. So when we make a grimace, it simply portrays displeasure, like an animal. Often the faces of Jews and minorities are portrayed with grimaces to highlight the belief that they are closer to animals than often, you know, white Christian men. You find many religious beliefs and orders that prohibit laughter, for example, because of its distorting effect on the face, and they make people act like animals. Animals never take anything seriously, and so they're always living in the false, in the illusion, whereas men who work evade what is false. But this is, of course, ideology. Rather in playfulness we take life really seriously. If by serious we mean deadly reality, like reality is harsh and terrifying, the grimace is not denying it. Playfulness doesn't deny that life can fuck you up. On the contrary, it is the proof of that knowledge, the proof that we know how bad life can be. And that's because when we express, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, we are expressing only in relationship to overwhelming power. Expression is the painful echo of overwhelming power, violence which finds utterance in complaint. It is always overdone, no matter how heartfelt it may be, because as in each work of art, the whole world seems contained in every plaintive sound. So expression is first and foremost expression of a complaint. Even when a child plays, his play is an echo to violence. It's a complaint. We often say that children are artists, but to be an artist, at least in this view, you have to know what suffering is. You know that idea that the greatest works of art are the ones that captured the most brutal suffering. Well, this is what playfulness means. When we play, it's like we make art. We see children playing, and yet in their enjoyment, like when you look at a sublime painting, you can hear every plaintive sound, like every scream. So you have an asymmetry in the work of art or in play, or in, you know, the grimace when you compare the act and what it really represents. Art is always disproportionate. With a simple brush strike, I can express the pain and suffering of a whole population going through genocide, for example. But this is where its weakness also lies. For enlightenment, disproportion means chaos, and chaos is terrible. So remember the first chapter when we talked about mimesis, that it is disproportionate because in one thing you can have something greater than itself. When you sacrifice an animal for the god, that animal is an actual substitute for the god. Here it's the same principle, but that would be superstitious, and superstitions don't make the world go round. It's not artists but engineers who make the world go round, because their work is always proportionate. So it's no coincidence that enlightenment has a boner for proportion and symmetry. Everything must be equivalent, everything must be exchangeable with something of the same identical value, and that's the proportionate response to suffering. Only activity is proportionate. It and not mimesis can bring an end to suffering. So you don't put an end on suffering by complaining, you have to do it with work. But it has its consequences. Its consequence is rigid, unmoved visage, culminating at the end of this age in the baby faces of the practical men, the politicians, priests, managing directors, racketeers. So the emphasis on work leads to the unmoved faces of the practical men who appear like baby faces. They are just, embellished by the advertisement and the cameras. The denial of emotion through the worship of work implies that from now on, everything must be pragmatic, everything must be useful, including emotions. The baby faces of the practical man is literally work. Like, people are paid to make the politician appear in a certain way while he is paid to show the specific expression during his speech. So work isn't the absence of emotion, but rather the use of emotions in practical ends. Emotions are studied, they are giving a scientific classification and a purpose. Specific ends are assigned to each emotions, so that when displayed they guarantee that end. Just like in management and in advertising, we know each emotion must be displayed or aroused to get the consumer to buy, the voter to vote, the adherent to believe, the worker to work, etc. So even when in labor camps the guards are yelling and screaming, their behavior is supervised and studied so that it only brings in the desired results. Quote, the strident voices of fascist rabble rousers and camp commanders show the reverent side of the same social condition. The screaming is as cold-blooded as business. Even the plaintive sounds of nature are appropriated as an element of technique. So, this is how disproportion is contained. We allow emotions, but for each a specific end is giving. Emotions become proportionate when they lead to the designed and desired end attributed to them. So the suffering of the victims only indicates that the system needs optimizing. Like when your boss allows you to complain, it's only for feedback, to know what is to be improved in the techniques of manipulation so that next time you don't complain. In the death camps, the screams and wailings have only one end that needs to be optimized, and that is terror. The plaintiff as well as the executioner's emotions must only indicate that terror is always here. Science has served no other purpose than manipulating terror and to announce it in this context. So the authors compare the bellowing of the camp commanders with the howling klaxon that people hear coming from military airplanes about to drop bombs. Like there are cries of terror that announce mechanically terror. It's like, you know, those experiments when you train a rat that when they hear a certain sound or see a red light, they know that they are about to be hit with an electric charge, for example. And this is where it gets fucked up. The terror that the victim experiences and the commander announces is also felt in the commander himself. The screams deliberately use the wail of the victim, which first called violence by its name, and even the mere word which designates the victim, Frenchman, Negro, Jew, to induce in themselves the desperation of the persecuted who have to hit out. So the screamers are the commanders here. Okay, they induce in themselves the desperation of those they persecute. Even they live in the same fear as their victims, from whom they are afraid. After all, the anti-Semite must be scared, must be batshit scared from the Jew, since the Jew is basically undisciplined mimesis, so they have to be afraid of that. But this is also the absurdity of reason. The totalitarian ideology of reason will require that nothing gets left out of it. Including, you know, the terror that it seeks to eliminate. So it reproduces that terror in its attempt to get rid of it. And so again, if the point of work is to escape from the violence of nature, then it is like, you know, the gods people believed in. As they promised to protect human beings from nature, they turn out to be more violent and ruthless than nature. So the same gods must induce the fear that they promised to liberate us from. So work must do the same thing. When the commander screams, which is, you know, his work, that's his job, he is also supposed to be living in the same fear that he blames the Jews for bringing. And so fear is, after all, too much useful when it comes to control. You know, like, in a way we are going to throw it away. Quote, they reproduce within themselves the insatiability of the power of which they are afraid. Everything must be used, everything must belong to them. So therefore the anti-Semite cannot live in peace. They can live only in fear. Fear reminds the subject that he can be tossed at any moment, that he cannot have roots anywhere, cannot have an identity. The commander's screams are also an expression of his fear that he himself one day will be the one at the labor camp. He too one day will be a mere instrument used only for the growth of power. So like he himself denies his own identity, to see that others have won is enough to give him reason to beat you up. For the anti-Semite, no one deserves to live without fear. The mere existence of the other is provocation. Everyone else gets in the way and must be shown their limits, the limits of limitless horror. No one who seeks shelter shall find it. Those who express what everyone craves, peace, homeland, freedom, will be denied it, just as nomads and traveling players have always been refused rights of domicile. Whatever someone fears, that is done to him. Even the last resting place shall be none. So here the authors refer to the spoiling of Jewish graveyards, for example, by fascists. Like even the dead cannot even stay at rest. They must be moved out or evicted. Nothing can remain protected from the pragmatism of progress. You can think of the dead piles of bodies that were burned because they were more useful burned than buried. Like hair, gold teeth, clothes, everything that was taken so that it can be recycled by the Nazi regimes for whom vulnerability only calls for more violence. Those evicted compulsively arouse the lust to evict them even more. The marks left on them by violence endlessly inflame violence. Anything which merely wants to vegetate must be rooted out. So those evicted are the Jews in this case. Once you are evicted, there is no limit to the violence that can befall on you. Even from the grave you are evicted. You know, like this is exactly what is happening to the Palestinians in Gaza right now. Like the Zionists, they are the modern day Nazis. So the fascists, when they see a bruise on someone, they read that as an invitation for breaking his bones. So the more vulnerable you are, the more violence you are going to experience. And so the more violence will come. You either live your entire life without ever getting hurt, or you conceal as much as you can your scars if you don't want any deeper wounds. And as such, no one can live in peace. No one can live anywhere. There is no such thing as a home, and so the worse it gets for you, the more reasonable it becomes to hurt you. Those who are vulnerable, after all, are closest to respond like animals when they are in danger. Like through the damage, their faculties have been inhibited to such a degree that the only thing still functional is the fight or flight mode. But the fight or flight mode is precisely what the fascists hate. It is nature in its most mimetic form. The chaotic regular flight reactions of the lower animals, the patterns of swarming crowds, the convulsive gestures of the tortured, all these express what wretched life can never quite control, the mimetic impulse. So the behavior of the most vulnerable only confirms the bias of the commander. The Jews, when they are beaten up to a pulp and reach the level of sleeping in their own urine and excrement in concentration camps, makes the commanders and fascists go like, see, I told you they were rotten. You know, I told you they were rotten. But Adorno and Horkheimer, they go further with this as they bring in the notion of freedom. The real threat that the anti-Semite is scared of is actually freedom. The scars that show in the grimace and in the complaint evokes freedom from oppression, which for the commander is impossible. There cannot be no freedom for the fascist. That's what the mimetic impulse signifies. Freedom. Like the suffering of the masses, of the Jews, of the victims, the Palestinians, the victims of persecution, is deeply unsettling because it is a call for freedom, a call to break from the system and from unjust rules. In the death throes of the creature, at the furthest extreme from freedom, freedom itself irresistibly shines forth as the thwarted destiny of matter. It is against this freedom that the idiosyncratic aversion, the purported motive of anti-Semitism is ultimately directed. And so we therefore go back to idiosyncrasy. All the personality of the fascist solely exists to deny that there is such thing as freedom. When the fascist experiences repulsion, what he is repulsed by is freedom. The conditioning of the system is so strong and pervasive that the subject learns to be disgusted by the thing that it craves the most, and is in his own interests. Freedom, like it's like your idiosyncrasy, everything that makes you you, is allergic to freedom. And so what is so scary in freedom is the risk of losing oneself. In the mimetic movement of nature, the individual doesn't feel like he exists, but that freedom is nonetheless valued. The fascist feels like he is in a dilemma, in a difficult choice between two options that he needs: freedom on the one hand and a sense of self on the other. So he tries desperately to find a common ground, a way to experience freedom but without losing his sense of self. His allergy to freedom is more the allergy to freedom without a sense of self, to freedom but within mimesis. But since we cannot live without mimesis, so we try to pretend that we are not mimetic creatures, or that we can experience mimesis without violating the reality principle. All the gesticulations devised by the Führer and his followers are pretexts for giving way to the mimetic temptation without openly violating the reality principle with honor, as it were. So, the reality principle is another concept, concept in psychoanalysis by Freud, and it says that we are creatures who are simply looking for our pleasure, but then in order to survive we have to repress our pleasures. And so the reality principle is morality. It's morality that tells us that certain pleasures are bad because they will lead to our destruction. And so the pleasure principle is the mimetic temptation, the temptation here that is often attributed to animals, like animals live by mimesis because they are driven by their craving for pleasure and avoidance of pain. And so because animals live in illusion and falsehood, they are forced to go beyond we are forced to go beyond our pleasures. Reality hits hard for human beings and demands that we sacrifice our pleasures. So the point of the fascists is to try to cheat nature. He wants to give in to pleasure, but without violating that principle. And so the figure of the Führer embodies this hope perfectly. For them, mimicking the Führer means that they have escaped mimesis' embrace and are now controlling mimesis. They can enjoy themselves without a care in the world because they finally cracked the formula. We can be free without losing who we are. And so that's what idiosyncrasy is, and that's why the fascists need to go all this way to rationalize his idiosyncrasy. Like, the more science and rationality is on the side of their prejudice, the more confident they feel in their idiosyncrasy. And so the more they feel like they've attained this freedom without losing themselves to mimesis. And so hence their hatred towards Jews, as we already said, is actually self-hatred. The Jew represents that raw mimesis against which idiosyncrasy must be rationalized, which, according to the anti-Semite, the Jews don't have. Yet the Jews also, according to the anti-Semites, are dominating them. They're like Shylock, always hijacking prices and keep the Aryans into submission. So basically they are doing what the fascists want to do, according to the fascists, without even needing to be rational. So Jews don't have a strong idiosyncrasy against mimesis, and so they are seen as weaklings who just give themselves to mimesis, and yet they dominate because they have the money or something. So the anti-Semite is the one with the slave morality. He is the one who is weak for not being able to stand against mimesis, and so he sees the master who is able to sustain mimesis without succumbing to it, and that is the Jew. And so he detests that master while wanting to become that master, while trying to mimic him. They detest the Jews and imitate them constantly. There is no anti-Semite who does not feel an instinctive urge to ape what he takes to be Jewishness. So it's like the anti-Semite resembles more the caricature that he makes of the Jew than the Jew. The anti-Semite usurped Jewishness while blaming it, and at the same time uses everything that he detests in it on others. They do everything that they accuse the Jews of doing, but they are never called out on it, because somehow when the Nazis do it, they don't violate the reality principle. Like, you see the ambiguity. When the Jew does it, it is giving in to the pleasure principle, to mimesis, to nature, etc. When you do it, when it's the Nazi who does it, it's aligned with the reality principle. Go figure. So while they claim that the Jews have no respect for others, they themselves don't give a shit about others. While they claim that the Jews have ridiculed facial expressions, the fascist leaders always distort their own faces with grimaces. Like everything they blame the Jews for, they reproduce. The argumentative jerking of the hands, the singing tone of voice, which vividly animates a situation or a feeling independently of judgment, and the nose that physiognomic principium individuosinis, which writes the individual's peculiarity on his face. So that's very important what they say about the nose. The nose is what always characterized the Jews in caricature, right? They have a long nose, a big nose, which determines the personality of the individual. There was a common pseudoscientific field in rational studies called physiognomy, and it is the belief that someone's character can be deduced from his outer appearance, mostly the face. So your facial features will reveal who you are as an individual. So a long nose that Jews are often portrayed with by anti-Semites indicates something messed up about their characters. The physiognomic traits become the principium individuationis, which means that your facial traits are what determine your individuality. So the authors here go on an explanation about the importance of the nose and why it is very important to understand how the anti-Semite mimics the Jew. They mimic the representation that they have of the Jew. They say that the nose represents a nostalgia for what is lower. This is something that they will come back to in the notes and sketches, so the last chapter, but we can already explain what's up with the nose. So the sense of smell, they argue, is associated with the earth. Like creatures who rely on the sense of smell are creatures that remain low because they smell the earth. They need to have their they need to face the earth. They need to look down because, well, they are smelling the earth. And so, as they write, the sense of smell is nostalgia for the longing for immediate union with surrounding nature, with earth and slime. And so, the Jew's long nose has two meanings here. First, it marks him as a lower creature in a judgmental way. Lower means inferior. And the second meaning of the long face is that it longs for a union with surrounding nature. So the nose is the perfect symbol for mimesis. It's the kind that absorbs you. All of the senses, of all the senses, the act of smelling, which is attracted without objectifying, reveals most sensuously the urge to lose oneself in identification with the other. That is, with smell as both the perception and the perceived, which are one in the act of olfaction is more expressive than other senses. When we see, we remain who we are. When we smell, we are absorbed entirely. So everything related to smells is debased as a disgrace and a sign of inferiority. The Jew is represented with a long nose, so a strong sense of smell, and therefore he is inferior. He belongs to the lower ranks, he belongs to the animals, he is unfit for civilization. But this is where the mimicking of the anti-Semite comes in. As we said, the anti-Semite, the civilized man, mimics the Jew. Right? He mimics the Jew's sense of smell, so normally the anti-Semite should be excluded from civilization. So how does he get around it? Well, this is where rationalization comes in. The anti-Semite, in order to recognize the Jew, needs to smell the Jew, right? So if you are this afraid of something, then you need to have a sharp sense of smell in order to find it. Especially if the thing that you are afraid of or that you are afraid of works in the dark, or is within the lowest ranks. It is if it is slithering like a snake among the dead leaves, you are forced to have the same sense of smell, the same sense of smell that it does as it does in order to find it. So you are doing the same thing that you hate. It's like you hate dogs, but you need dogs to track down the thief's trails. So you rationalize it. You say that I'm only using the dogs in order to track down the thief. Like the anti-Semite mimics the Jew only to hunt down the Jew. So like for example, I give in to the pleasures of mimesis, not because I want to, but because of a practical and rational purpose. The civilized person is allowed to give way to such desires only if the prohibition is suspended by rationalization in the service of practical purposes, real or apparent. So it's okay for me to indulge in pleasure because what I'm doing is to expunge pleasure. It is like thinking that those who engage in BDSM are using pleasure to not have pleasure. So the sadist isn't hurting out of pleasure, but because the sub needs discipline. And the masochist isn't enjoying the pain, but he is learning not to enjoy pleasure. So it's like, the castration principle. You can only enjoy something if you are committed to not enjoying it. But for those in power, this is just pretend. It's actually a sneaky way to go around the reality principle and just lash out all the violence that you want to enjoy on others. Once you sniff out that bad smell of the Jew, you can justify all kinds of violence on them. You get to enjoy your unrationalized pleasure. All you need to do was to say that pleasure was bad, and then find a perfect scapegoat that doesn't want to repress their pleasures. There the prohibition is suspended, and the reality principle becomes a mere illusion maintained so that no one holds you accountable for what you are going to do to the scapegoat. Anyone who sniffs out bad smells in order to extirpate them may imitate to his heart's content the snuffling which takes its unrationalized pleasure in the smell itself. So in those situations, the anti-Semite gets to mimic the Jew even more than the Jew mimics the Jew. Where the forbidden impulse can finally elude the prohibition. Or suspend the prohibition. So the anti-Semite is simply waiting for the moment the impulse can be legitimate in ignoring the prohibition. Before that threshold is reached, they indulge in seriousness and constantly repress play, but once that threshold is reached, which is the goal since day one, then all the repressed rage and anger and pleasure are let loose. Now laughter, mockery, playfulness, violence, orgasms, pleasures, all of them triumph. Everything that they considered badly sins becomes suddenly virtues, since they are all aimed at the destruction of those they hate, those who they deem incapable of resisting sins. So the anti-Semite, they manage to repress their desires, they manage to resist sin, but the Jews didn't, and therefore the anti-Semite will wreak havoc on their ass while indulging in their own pleasures and desires. That is the schema of the anti-Semitic reaction. The anti-Semites gather to celebrate the moment when authority lifts the ban. The moment alone makes them a collective, constituting the community of kindred spirits. Their ranting is organized laughter. The more dreadful the accusations and threats, the greater the fury, the more withering is the scorn. So all of this so that they can make mimetic behavior possible without losing their sense of self, which they end up losing anyways. They think that the more violent they act, the more successful they will be at keeping Apollo at bay, but they don't realize that they are just turning into Daphnes. Revolution is looked at by the fascists like Daphne looks at Apollo, by the way. The conspiracy theory that Nazis believing that Jews are financing the Bolsheviks, that the Jews have brought communism, all of it stems from this fear to lose oneself in mimesis. In revolution, the fascist cannot have power or control over others. He cannot indulge into his destructive pleasures. He has no control over mimesis, so he accuses the communists of being destructive and tries to control mimesis to counter any revolutionary potential. The elaborate symbols proper to every counter-revolutionary movement, the death's heads and masquerades, the barbaric drumming, the monotonous repetition of words and gestures, are so many organized imitations of magical practices, the mimesis of mimesis. So their only chance to remain in power is to be the ones who decide on mimesis. Like their faith in science is an attempt to do that. They want to see the scientific formula in the gestures, voices, charisma, and facial features of their Führer, so the Führer reassures them because he too is a machine without agency. He is like a doll that performs when you flip the switch. Like we said about emotions, they are all studied, they're all giving a scientific justification, and therefore the Führer is a robot, it's a computer, it's a machine. And so when machines run everything, human beings can finally relax. Everything is being supervised by pure rationality at last. And so this exempts us from having to think, from having to check or suspect, whether something is wrong with the machine. The fascist leaders can do anything, say whatever they want. It can be pure speculation, sheer absurdity, unadulterated lies, you name it. He will get away with it because no one will doubt it. Because, it's a machine that is speaking. So everything that they do, even if it is bullshit and goes against everything agreed upon in the reality principle, will be justified because it is what's protecting us from the Jews. As long as lies, violence, and pleasures fulfill their assigned role, the extermination of evil, no act will be disproportionate, no matter how horrible or contradictory it may be. As they say, Hitler can gesticulate like a clown. Mussolini risk false notes like a provincial tenor, gobble stocks as glibly as a Jewish agent whose murder he is recommending. Coogan preach love like the Savior himself, whose crucifixion he impersonates for the sake of yet more bloodshed. So the asterisk refers to Charles Edward Coughlin, who was an anti-Semitic Catholic priest who was making radio speeches. So we see that the anti-Semite mimics everything that can actually have a revolutionary potential. To act like the jester, to make errors, to talk glibly, to preach love, etc. All of these can resist power. But the fascist is seeking power, so he corrupts them. He makes love a tool for shedding more blood, for example. Fascism is also totalitarian in seeking to place oppressed nature's rebellion against domination directly in the service of domination. So Jews, therefore, they are necessary for anti-Semites. Without them, the anti-Semite loses all sense of his identity. The anti-Semite can only exist as an anti-Semite, as a Jew hater. That's the only thing that can have roots about him. No other parts of his identity have substantial substance besides his hatred. And as such, the anti-Semite must always make the Jews visible for him. They must always be smelled and seen by the fascist so that the fascist can be a fascist and indulge into his desires. Their artificiality heightened visibility acts on the legitimate son of Gentile civilization like a kind of magnetic field. So Gentiles means non-Jewish person, like they're attracted to the Jews like a magnetic field, and so they always artificially heighten their physical traits so that no one misses them. And therefore the Gentile is always feeling that someone alien is close to him because he's making them. Like having denied the humanity they share in common with Jews, now the closest thing that they need is something completely uncanny. The anti-Semite is therefore in a paradoxical situation. He needs to keep at a distance the thing that he needs to be the closest to. And so such a state can only be achieved through immediate violence. It's only through direct violence that I can be both close and far away from something like, like, for example, an abusive spouse. The abusive spouse is seeking connection, that's the mimetic impulse, but given the danger of losing himself in the process, the only way he can remain himself is by rationalizing his violence towards his partner, towards his wife, for example. So it is only in his violent rage and abuse that he can experience the impulses that he had denied himself. Abusive husbands are abusive because they have denied themselves playfulness. When they hit, it's always after blaming their wives for neglecting her duties. They hit her because she was playful. She didn't take seriously her task as a wife, for example. The shirt wasn't ironed properly, the dinner wasn't well cooked, etc. So the wife of the abusive husband is blamed for being for giving in to the impulses that he has denied himself. So he built his idiosyncrasy through work while she did through play. And so this gives him the right to experience play only in its violence, only in its violent form, because play is only legitimate through punishment, as a torture, as a work. And so it is okay for me to play if by playing I submit the other to work, like the other forces me to work so that she can play around all day. And so in this way, the tabooed impulses, which run counter to work in its dominant form, are converted into conforming idiosyncrasies. So the anti-Semite has the same relationship with the Jew. The Jews and beaten wives are necessary because it's only through them that the Gentile and the abusive husband can experience the mimetic impulse without losing their identity. Same thing between Palestinians and Zionists. Zionist needs the Palestinian in order to, indulge in his desires. So even the prestigious places that the Jews occupied had no protective powers against anti-Semitism. Their economic position, as we've said with Shylock, were only given to make them the bigger target so that those responsible for economic crisis and exploitation avoid harm. The Sultan or the king did nothing wrong, it's always his Jewish visor, his Jewish visor. So Jews being the anti-race, which we mentioned last time, which we mentioned the time before last time. So Jews being the anti-race, they are forced to build a strong fortress against them. The kings and sultans will not say no to this. Will not say no to this once they are attacked. And so nationalism is that fortress which will keep the Jews away. And so they say if the holders of economic power have once overcome their fear of employing fascist agents in the face of the Jews, the harmony of the national community is automatically established. They are sacrificed by the dominant order when, through its increasing estrangement from nature, it has reverted to mere nature. So here, the Jew is accused of being a cheater, like we mentioned earlier. They're accused of manipulating the masses through dark forbidden magic and bloody rituals, while they are sacrificing through propaganda and anti-Semitic, more violent rituals. And so mimetic sacrifice and the violence of nature that the modern man secretly wants can finally be justified if its object is the Jew, if it's regression, magic, and superstition. So the modern man doesn't want reason or progress. He wants a rationalized justification for sacrifice and mimesis. He wants to experience those, but not like the idiots of the past who did it through superstition. He will do it with science. Science is like, the new God, and like all gods, it demands blood. And that blood will be served by those who do not conform to the new order. So those who do not believe in science will be the feast for the new God. And that way the anti-Semite can still experience mimesis in its most forbidden and horrific ways. Simply by accusing the Jews of mimesis, the fascists can indulge in it without any restraint or shame, like kings and sultans accusing their visors when things go wrong. And so they accuse the Jews of doing the most barbaric acts, typically of cannibalism. The acts, that sent us back in prehistory, and therefore the fascists can enjoy their cannibalistic feast in civilized forms. We accuse the Jews of being the cannibals, and so we, as modern men, can enjoy our cannibal feast behind closed doors. So they don't have to hold back anymore. They can bite as hard as they desire in the flesh of the Jew. There is no need to restrain at all. Every complaint will be projected on the Jew. Anyone who accuses the fascist of cannibalism will instead be directed against the Jew. Like it's them, the real cannibals, not us. We are rational, enlightened men. So, as Horkheimer and Adorno argue, rationality only brought the possibility for evil to be acted out in reality. Quote, it can be acted out in reality, and the evil which is acted out surpasses even the evil content of the projection. The popular nationalist fantasies of Jewish crimes, of infanticide and sadistic excesses, of racial poisoning and international conspiracy precisely define the anti-Semitic dream and fall short of its realization. So in short, they accuse the Jews of some bad shit and find in it the opportunity to do even worse than what they accuse the others of doing. And so this is what the authors mean by Nazi mimic Jews. They mimic the representation that they have of the Jews. They want to commit those crimes they imagine that the Jews are committing. They want to kill kids. They want to be sadist to their extreme. They want to dominate the world, etc. But they accuse the Jews of wanting those things. So they need to make sure that the Jews become like they are imagining them. Once things have gone so far and mere word Jew appears like the bloody grimace, whose image, skull and mangled cross in one is unfurled on the swastika flag, the fact that someone is called a Jew as a provocation to set about him until he resembles that image. So, to set out about someone means in informal English to beat them or attack them. So you beat someone into the image that you have of them. To be called a Jew becomes an invitation to beat someone into your own projection of them. And so the Nazis want the Jew to appear like the bloody grimace so that the Nazi can show his bloody grimace. The skull with the cross is what the fascists want the Jew to look like, so that they can put their skull on their own flag. That's how the authors interpret the swastika flag. It's an imitation of the image that the Nazis have of the Jews. And so the image of the Jews got stuck, the image that the Jews got stuck with, starting with the image of the merchant, which we explained the week before, was an image that the Jews got forced into. I mean, the more you attack someone, the more you repress them, the more they will conform to the image of someone who commits crimes, because that's what the destitute often do. So you prevent someone from being a human being, and then you complain that they are acting like animals. You know, I mean, you can just be honest with yourself and say that you are the one who wants to act like an animal, instead of you accusing someone else of being an animal so you can act like an animal with them. And so that seems to be civilization. To repress nature so that everything turns into nature. And so in nature, everything is out for itself. You repress that in civilization. You dominate nature by imposing laws and rules of restrictions. But then you reproduce nature's principle within the walls of civilization with a degree that is worse than what it was under restrictions. It's like you make a law that punishes stealing so that the powerful can steal more than anyone who gets arrested by the law. Civilization is a triumph of society over nature, a triumph which transforms everything into mere nature. But the mimesis of the Jews by the anti-Semite isn't just a matter of projection. After all, the Nazis aren't the first civilization that have been using the same process that all civilizations been enacting. All civilizations need to triumph over nature to some extent and reproduce that nature within its walls. The Nazis were basically the extremes that wanted to even get rid of that reproduction. They wanted to dominate nature, the nature reproduced within the walls of civilization, even that. And so that's the mimesis of mimesis that we mentioned earlier. Like, enlightened societies were all on the path towards fascism. And by enlightened societies, we don't mean societies that came in the 18th century, but civilization itself. All civilizations have a tendency towards fascism in one way or another, especially if you are a patriarchal civilization. And according to the authors, the Jews are the oldest patriarchal civilization and the incarnation of monotheism. And therefore, the mimicry of the Jews by fascists run deep. The Nazis were actually doing to the Jews what the Jews did to those who lived before them and were their contemporaries. The Jews looked at other societies as regressive. They accused the Canaanites, for example, the Egyptians, and others of magic, and repressed their own nature in ways aligned with everything we said about Enlightenment's self-destructive nature. Quote, as the oldest surviving patriarchy, the incarnation of monotheism, they converted taboos into maxims of civilization, while the others were still enmeshed in magic. The Jews appear to have successfully achieved what Christianity had attempted in vain, the disempowerment of magic by means of its own strength, which as worship of God is turned against itself. They have not so much eradicated the adaptation of nature as elevated it to the pure duties of ritual. So the disempowerment of magic and the attack of superstition led to the vengeful God that we know from the Old Testament. That God, Yahweh, was the revenge of suppressed magic and nature, which demanded an even greater sacrifice than the one usually offered in magical stages. Those who follow the Pharaoh had to be sacrificed to the sea to appease the wrath of, suppressed magic. And hence the Jews did not eradicate nature, but given it a stronger hold on them as they elevated it to their rituals. As such, they could keep the power of magic, but without repressing into mythological beliefs or into polytheism or animism. They don't mention the story of Moses versus the Pharaoh, but it's a good way to understand their point. Moses, I think everyone knows the story. He got into a contest with the Pharaoh to prove the superiority of his God. There were, magicians performing all kinds of feats, but then Moses throws his stick and it turns into a serpent. And so this is not the action of Moses, but that of his God. And so the point of their monotheistic God and not magicians should have the power. The point is this: only their God and not the magicians must have the power to turn inanimate matter like a stick into a living organism, a snake. And so that's progress, which later on with European Enlightenment, it was no longer God but science that keeps the power of magic. And so when that hits, it was now the Jews who became the Egyptians, but their repression, is even more violent than what they did to the pharaohs in the Bible, since, as the authors write, they are therefore regarded by advanced civilization as both backward and too advanced, like and unlike, shrewd and stupid. They are pronounced guilty of what, as the first citizens, they were the first to subdue in themselves: the susceptibility to the lure of base instinct, the urge towards the beast and the earth, the worship of images. Because they invented the concept of the kosher, they are persecuted as swine. So their repression is greater because they are regarded as the first to bring in enlightenment into its most, advanced form, and therefore their fall will be only bigger. You can even say that the retaliation that they suffered from God after they went back to worshipping golden bowls when Moses was away to receive the Ten Commandments was already a proto-Holocaust. Just like, tragic heroes who bring in an enormous step of progress, their downfall will be unforgivable and more violent than the most barbaric act in prehistoric times. Like when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, that was, the moment Enlightenment really started. And for doing that, they have brought progress as well as the greatest demise. And hence, the Nazis mimic the Jews even to this point. Like they brought their own demise and the demise of those before them, the Nazis will do the same. As Adorno and Horkheimer conclude the fifth thesis, the anti-Semites appoint themselves executors of the Old Testaments. They see to it that the Jews, having eaten the tree of knowledge, unto dust shall return. And so hence we have the idiosyncrasy of the anti-Semite, an executor of the Old Testament, the most Jewish thing you can do, apparently. It's a weird thesis, but that's Adorno and Horkheimer. And That's it for today. We've been through the fifth thesis. Next time we will do the sixth one. That was the fifth one. Next time the sixth one. As always, I hope that you enjoyed it and that you will find it very useful and helpful to read these complex works. And